I'm bouncing along a dirt road in a Forest Service truck, winding across the hilly backside of Left Hand Canyon, just outside of Boulder, Colorado. Forest Service Information Officer Mara Washburn is at the wheel.
We're gonna bottom out for a second here.
Okay. The terrain here is steep, rocky, and very woody. Lodgepole and ponderosa pines mixed with aspen trees form a thick canopy. And there's more than a hint of smoke in the air. We're entering the Forsyth 2 project area, where the U.S. Forest Service is doing a little preventative care. I'm joining on the final day of a prescribed burn.
Yeah, go. Hey, will you and Finn be back at drop point 15 anytime in the near future?
And this is drop point 15. Find a place to park.
We pull off to a designated site to park between a few trees. There are government trucks, fire engines, and helmeted firefighters scattered around.
You'll see most of the firefighters out here right now. We have Wyoming interagency hotshot crews out here. We have some local fire departments helping us out. It's all the beginning of their seasons. They're sort of young, ready to go, excited to start another fire season.
It's towards the end of May, and getting close to when it becomes too risky to conduct a prescribed burn due to hot and dry summer conditions. It's also the time of year when actual wildfires start breaking out across the country, and resources get pulled to those. Luckily, the Forsyth 2 project made progress this season.
So once you intentionally have fire on the ground, you're working pretty long days. So these folks are at the end of a sort of long month of firework. And it's gone really well, which is cool.
Mara hands me a helmet, a thick, flame-resistant, bright yellow shirt, and a pair of bulky pants to put on.
They're gonna be
okay.
large on you guys.
I don't care how I look.
We'd rather them be large than not fit, so I kind of have just the larger sizes.
Totally fine. Then she introduces me to Charlie Rayner, a fire prevention officer who's been helping manage the burn here.
Let's take a walk.
Okay. We hike down the back side of a hillside, passing a couple of Type 6 fire engines. They're basically pickup trucks with 300-gallon water tanks, large pumps, and hoses on them. The air smells like a strong campfire everywhere. There's small plumes of smoke across the landscape.
Our fire effects look amazing. Definitely met objectives as far as reducing the fuels that are on the ground, the surface fuels.
The purpose of a prescribed burn is to get rid of excess leaves, branches, and other plant material that can build up and create a wildfire hazard. These low-intensity fires also encourage new growth, improve wildlife habitat, and support general ecosystem health.
And what you can look out and see is kind of a mosaic on the ground of greener grasses and then area that's black and charred and burned.
Other than a little black around the base of the trees on one side, I can hardly tell that they just sat through a fire. As Charlie and I walk along the fire break, he explains that that's part of the strategy in a burn like this. I see a small flare-up from a smoldering brush patch as it snags a bit more fuel.
By getting rid of those, that prevents trees from catching fire and burning up the whole canopy and killing the tree. I wouldn't be surprised in a few days from now we're going to see some areas greening up already. Some new fresh grass, new plants coming in. So everything looks really good.
Fire is inherently unpredictable. It's also as much a part of these mountains as the trees themselves. But humans are still learning how to live alongside it. Prescribed burns give us a chance to work with fire on our terms. And every time we light a prescribed burn, we're making a calculated choice. We're betting that a fire we control today could help prevent catastrophe tomorrow.
We haven't yet gotten to the point where humans can successfully live with fire. And we need to get to a point where we're prepared for it when large uncontrollable fires move in our direction. They're going to start where we don't want them to start. They're going to get the wind and they're going to move. And we need to do our best to prepare for it. And prescribed fire is one of those tools where, we can get out ahead of it in a planned manner. I've been doing this for 25 years. I'm an ambassador of fire. I believe in it as a natural process, and I also believe in it as a tool to help us with what's going on in the West with wildland fire. We all love the outdoors and the Rocky Mountains and recreating outside. It's important to take care of these places, and fire is a part of that. It's just like the rain and the wind. It's just a part of life.
This is United by Fire, a podcast exploring the hard truths about our landscapes and ourselves. My name is Kristan Uhlenbrock, and from the Institute for Science and Policy, this is Season 4 of Laws of Notion. The Forsyth II project is an 18,000-acre wildfire mitigation operation that spans the Arapahoe and Roosevelt National Forest, Boulder County open space, and private lands. The area is considered high risk due to the growing number of people and homes nearby, as well as its proximity to Gross Reservoir, which helps supply water to about 1.5 million people in the Denver area. And part of the Forsyth II project is this prescribed burn. I head into the command center, a white canvas tent that looks like something straight out of a Lewis and Clark expedition.
Hey.
Hello.
There's a wood-burning stove for warmth, and inside is the guy in charge, the burn boss, Michael Smith, or better known as Smitty.
This is the glamorous side of fire right here.
He and some others are hunched over a computer, watching time-lapse footage from yesterday's ignition.
Now watch a couple of trees fall in the middle of the night. There's going to be one here. Wham. Where is it coming? Bam, there's one, and then there's one. And what's cool is watch the smoke in the morning. I thought we were pushing way more smoke.
A prescribed fire is by no means set it and forget it. To prepare for one, crews have to clear vegetation and cut fire breaks. Once the burn starts, they watch its behavior, putting out unexpected flare-ups and using shovels, rakes, and drip torches to manage it. It takes a special set of skills and expertise to oversee such a complex operation. And everyone on site defers to Smitty. Before I talk to him, I've been warned that at any moment he could be pulled away.
I make no promises of avoiding expletives.
No problem. It's okay, we've had that happen. Putting together a prescribed burn requires years of permits, planning, and engagement.
The first round of treatments are mechanical, and the silviculturists and foresters come up with that prescription of how many trees do we want per acre, and what's the age diversity, and what's the species diversity that we want. So are we specifically looking just to reduce fire danger, or are we looking to a more biological standpoint of, are we trying to reduce noxious weeds? Are we trying to get more sun down to the soil so that we can increase ground cover? We spend a lot of time developing that prescription, and then we have to get all of the resources together, the engines and the crews and the smoke monitors and the public outreach.
That all gets put into what's called a burn plan. It's a legal document, and safety is always the top priority. Communities and structures must be protected, and there are backup plans to the backup plans.
We have primary, alternative, contingency, and emergency. So we have 4 plans out of the gate before we will implement, because fires do escape. Mother Nature does not like to be controlled. A long time ago, they used to call these controlled burns, and that was just not an appropriate way to describe them. They're prescribed burns.
Smitty's watching the weather for changes in temperature, wind, and humidity, and checking how dry the vegetation and soil are. He looks at the amount and type of fuel on the ground and the landscape's features like hills, valleys, and bodies of water. He has to weigh a lot of different factors, but one of the biggest ones is smoke.
We're going to have fires. Now, if we burn on our terms in a prescribed setting, then we can have shorter duration, lower quantities of smoke produced, as opposed to those summer-long events where we're filling up the Front Range valleys or the different places. You look at what happened last year with Canada dumping all of its smoke into the East Coast. By doing prescribed fire, we are introducing lower quantities of smoke in a more controlled condition, because if on our best days, when we've got really good atmospheric conditions, we're lifting that smoke up and out and transporting it a long way, and it mixes out as it does that.
One of the more clever questions I've heard has been, how do you want your smoke? Proponents of prescribed burns say it's better to be in control of when and how much smoke goes into the atmosphere. Smaller doses, timed right. For example, we have a bad ozone problem during the summer months up and down the Front Range. So when smoke from mega fires, like we've seen from Colorado to California to Canada, rolls in, that can dramatically worsen our air quality.
That's why we see it pooling down into these valleys and really impacting people, not just physically, but psychologically. It's a traumatic, visceral response to smoke and fire.
Forests have been dancing with flames for millennia. It's part of nature trying to find its balance. But here's the thing. Not all fires are created equal. Those mega infernos that dominate the news, those can devastate entire ecosystems. And smaller, low-intensity fires, they can act like a reset button. They clear out the forest floor, making room for new growth. They even act like fertilizer, returning vital nutrients to the soil. It's a reminder that in nature, destruction and renewal often go hand in hand.
We have to do more prescribed fire, but the problem is there are so many constraints upon us. Unfortunately, every rule and law out there is created from somebody making a mistake, and we are painting ourselves further and further into a corner. The amount of administrative load that goes into doing these prescribed fires, getting the public buy-in, getting our agency administrators buy-in, getting our stakeholders and partners to buy into this before we can even think about putting fire on the ground is a heavy lift.
There are a ton of legal hurdles to clear before we can even think about starting a prescribed fire. You've got federal clean air laws and liability concerns, and every county has its own set of restrictions. So these burns often get delayed or canceled. The goal of the Forsyth 2 project is to treat 931 acres. But after the conclusion of the second year of prescribed burns, crews are only about halfway there. Smitty says we've got to find ways to lessen the bureaucracy.
That's one of the things that we need to continue to speak to power, is that we need to do this. Everybody knows we need to do it. We've recognized that we've got the science to back it up. We need more prescribed fire, we need more fuels treatments, but it costs money. And through the bipartisan infrastructure law, we got a good injection of money, but that's going to dry out. We're already starting to see that money fall away.
And even if you manage to check all the boxes and get all the resources in place, there's still the issue of public perception.
Especially living in the Mountain West, we have a visceral fear of fire. And it's not just a physical response to this, it's an emotional response. And getting people to understand that good fires can prevent bad fires. It is part of the ecosystem to burn. It wants fire. It's just a matter of balance. So unless we continue to do this, we're going to see extreme fire behavior. We're going to see homes lost, lives threatened or lost, and people's lives changed forever. So most of us are mountain dwellers because we love this environment. I live right over there, about less than a mile. And so I care. I mean, I walk around and I look at the forest and I see if I ever get a fire here, we're in trouble. So, yeah, I think we just need to keep going. We need to continue to be inventive in our ways of thinking. We need to embrace science, and we need the money to do it. Off with you people. I got work to do.
When Tegan Blakey first saw large areas of trees being cut down in the forest near her home in 2014, she wasn't quite sure what to think. At the time, she was just 19 years old, and the dense forested landscape she'd grown up with was being transformed.
You know, you might think of a meadow, but that's not quite what it is because you've had a forest and you've cut it all down. So what you're left with is a lot of stumps, dirt, branches, as well as the soil being kind of ripped up by the mechanical equipment that's been in there.
The technique is called clear cutting, and it wasn't just the look of it that bothered her. It was the lack of explanation. So she and her neighbors started asking questions.
It was just kind of like, what the hell is going on there? So asking questions, reaching out to the Forest Service and trying to figure out what was going on. So it was more of just a kind of discovery before it became like, this is something we need to get engaged in.
For Tegan, the forest wasn't just scenery. It was part of her identity. She loved the feeling of being folded into nature, where it felt peaceful and remote. It was home. Tegan lives in Nederland, Colorado, which sits around 8,000 feet. It is known for its outdoor recreation opportunities and small town charm.
So it's a community, mountain community, about 30 minutes from Boulder. Most owners held about 3 acres of land with one house and a lot of forest on the property. So there's some properties that are meadow. And then around the community, we abut to national forest with some hiking trails, some campsites, but also a lot of kind of, what I'm going to say, undeveloped National Forest Service property, where it's mostly just forests. No one necessarily is out there biking or hiking in some areas because there aren't trails.
Some members of the community weren't against forest management, but they were definitely concerned about how it was being done. So they got together and formed a nonprofit, the Magnolia Forest Group, of which Tegan now serves as president.
Initially, there were a lot of emails to the Forest Service that they kind of brushed aside. One of our neighbors reached out to get a copy of the work order for the acres that they'd been treating. And I think at the same time, someone had gotten a hold of the environmental analysis that was done, and comparing the two realized they didn't match, which is a big problem, just logistically even, regardless of what you think of a project. And it might have been around that point, one individual privately engaged a lawyer, and then when the nonprofit was organized, we engaged the same lawyer. And only when the legal letterhead hit the Forest Service's table did they really take notice and kind of straighten up to talk to us.
As it turns out, the Forest Service was working on the first iteration of a fuel reduction project called Forsyth, the precursor to the project Smitty is working on. Its goal was to reduce wildfire risk by clearing hazardous fuels and slowing the spread of mountain pine beetles, which had been killing trees since the mid-90s across Colorado, including the Front Range. But Tegan felt the rationale for the project was elusive.
It really centers around either fire mitigation or forest health. And it's a bit of a circular conversation.
A strategy that focuses on fuels reduction might be different than a strategy for forest restoration or a strategy for wildlife habitat. Ecosystems are complex. It's that diversity that makes them healthy and resilient, but also quite difficult to manage. It's hard to find a single strategy that doesn't come with some level of trade-off. And the Forest Service didn't have the community's trust.
They would say, okay, it's not about forest health, it's about fire mitigation, to protect the community. And then we dive into those details and it would be like, well, this isn't really addressing fire mitigation. Oh, well, it's actually for forest health. And so around we'd go. Basically, they just had different perspectives of why they were doing the project than what we saw was being accomplished by their work. There was not a lot of good feeling mutually, I think. They didn't appreciate our criticism. We didn't trust what they were telling us at that point. So there were a lot of emails back and forth. And then eventually, I think with the legal pressure, the Forest Service decided to pull the project.
The original iteration of the Forsyth project was stopped. But for Tegan, It raised questions about whose interests get represented and how a community's values get incorporated into larger decisions.
The Forest Service is more concerned, I'm going to say numerically, with how a forest is composed. Whereas residents, people who are out to enjoy the forest, aren't counting trees, aren't looking at diameter, aren't necessarily considering when was the last fire through here, when should the next fire be. And I think there is a point in the middle. Maybe forests, some places need to be dense for certain wildlife, and it might be really bad for fire. But that doesn't mean it's not a natural part of the ecosystem. I guess what I'm saying is that forest health might look different for a community than it does to the Forest Service, who also is looking at it kind of removed. They have hundreds of thousands of acres to manage. They don't particularly care about 10 acres here or there. Whereas a community that lives right next to those 10 acres here and there really cares about those because they know them like the back of their hand.
A few years later, the Forest Service introduced the Forsyth 2 project. Again, focused on reducing wildfire risk to communities and trying to create a healthier ecosystem. The goal was to restore areas of ponderosa pine, aspen, and meadows to a more natural state, and to reduce the heavy lodgepole pine canopy, making the ecosystem more resilient to fire. The project also gave private landowners permission to create more defensible space around their homes by expanding that work onto nearby federal lands. And this time, the agency took different steps to engage more with local communities.
It wasn't so much like, are we going to have this project or not have this project? It was more like, how are we going to get through this? Where can we find the balance where you're sort of happy and we're sort of happy and we can move on?
Tegan was invited out on field trips to learn about the work being done.
And it was really invaluable being out on the ground looking at the same thing. We learned more about kind of the science as far as like measurements and how the Forest Service goes about doing that. And I think on the other hand, they learned some things that they didn't see from their aerial imaging. They'd go, oh, well, actually, yeah, maybe we don't want to cut there because it looks different on the ground. So I think there was some give and take. I think we also got to know each other more as like people, which I believe is really important. It's easier to have a conversation and disagree when you know a person beyond just the name on the email.
Tegan sees her community's advocacy as a part of a larger push for a more holistic Forest Service approach. For her, it's not just about the trees.
That's a component, but there's so much more. It's all one big web of everything connected.
There's a fundamental theme to this series: humanity's role in nature. When do we intervene? When do we step back? And who gets to make these decisions?
Something I always have to remind myself is that we are already performing intervention every single day. The way that we stop fires, the way that we emit more CO2, right? We're intervening in every single aspect of our lives, whether it's through fragmentation of habitat, all the way to putting houses in places where then firefighters are going to stop fire from moving through that forest. How can we intervene in a way that's more like stewardship as opposed to negative effects?
This is Kiara Forrester, the Forest Program Director for the Watershed Center, a nonprofit based in Boulder County.
We really want it to be a situation where we can have managed wildfire doing what it does best around communities, and that communities have the resources, the home hardening, the defensible space in place so that fire can move around them and it's not catastrophic.
Kiara grew up in Oregon, surrounded by the dense rainforest-like ecosystems of the Cascades. And she held a traditional conservationist view that every tree needed to stay.
I had very black and white thinking and cried when I saw, my first tree get cut down in Oregon. I was pretty unable to see the nuance of ecological management. I was at a point where I was like, cutting any tree is bad, horrible. Humans should never do it. We should never intervene in nature, being nature, right?
Over time, her perspective changed. While earning a PhD in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Colorado Boulder, she learned how land management can both harm and help the environment. For example, indigenous peoples used cultural burning to support biodiversity and provide resources, whereas European settlers cleared large areas of forested land to make room for crops and livestock, a practice that dramatically altered landscapes and wiped out habitats.
I try to look for that balance. Taking small steps, looking at our desired future conditions first, say, what do we want to see? We want to see a system that can receive wildfire and grow back into a forest after that. And so moving from that desired future condition, we can then look at what are some potential ways to get to that, and how do we know if we're messing it up? How do we know if we're doing it well? And at what points are we checking that and then adjusting as needed?
It's a different approach known as adaptive management, and she wanted to use it to make a difference on the ground.
I wanted to make it so that my knowledge that I was gaining was more applied to a situation that involves both complex ecological and complex human social questions, rather than publishing to have it sit behind a paywall that only other scientists could read.
Kiara got out of academia and began working with communities, listening to their values and visions for the land. One example is a project she heads up called the St. Vrain Forest Health Partnership, a collaboration of over 100 stakeholders, including federal agencies, local governments, nonprofits, private landowners, and water suppliers.
The entire purpose of the St. Vrain Forest Health Partnership is to say that we're all in this together. We know that risk spills over from property to property. Our overarching vision is that our watershed can sustain wildfire and climate change while protecting water supplies, keeping diverse flora and fauna for future generations, and really making it so that fire, which is a really critical part of our landscape, can be on our landscape, and that it can be more of a severe weather event for our communities rather than a catastrophic threat to life and property.
The region Kiara works in stretches from Rocky Mountain National Park, heading east across the northern part of the Front Range to lower elevations. And wildfire risk looms large.
We look across the federally owned land to the private land to the county land, and we try to pair projects together in a mosaic across the landscape, because we know that contiguous treated areas are going to be more effective in reaching our goals of slowing wildfire near highly valued resources and assets so that firefighters can stay on the ground for longer.
She's working to thin overgrown forest, do prescribed burns, and teach residents how to create defensible space around their homes.
Our viewpoint as an organization is that landowners are collaborators. We're co-managing their property together. As a nonprofit, we don't own land. We're not able to say, we're just going to go out and do this. We want to hear what their values are, what their knowledge of that property is. They live on that property day in, day out. A lot of them have for decades. And so they've seen how things have changed over time. And so we really come at it from a place of wanting to understand the landowners' viewpoints, their values, their perspectives, and then finding a medium where ecological and human objectives can meet.
Many people have deep emotional ties to the places they live and ideas on how it should look. So the concept of cutting down or trimming trees to reduce wildfire risk isn't always an easy sell.
Logging was historically conducted and is still conducted in many regions of the country and the world to this day, primarily and only for human benefit. And so pushing back against managers who are doing something that has often been for economic gain is super valid, right?
But Chiara points out that there is also a deeper friction that needs to be acknowledged and overcome.
When I was young, I read a lot of books about, hidden logging practices in the Pacific Northwest conducted by the Forest Service, and it really made me concerned about the Forest Service's approach to management. There's a lot of mistrust of our federal agency partners because of kind of a historic lack of clarity, of really meaningfully engaging residents in this decision making. But I've seen an incredible shift. Now that I'm in this world, working with people who I view as visionaries in this landscape, I've just really been inspired by their approach and their openness to collaboration and really doing it meaningfully. Like, I disagree sometimes with things that the district ranger says, and then we have a conversation about it, and he's as open to my disagreement as I am to his. And I really hope that people know that there are people that really care about the complexity.
Like with many socially complex problems, there needs to be an understanding of the history while acknowledging mistakes, being accountable, and giving space for change. And for any relationship to evolve, it needs to be a two-way street.
It's hard to say, yeah, we messed up then, trust us now, right? And so I think we teach science as black and white in schools. And so helping to teach folks about uncertainty, about evolution and how we think, about why we use adaptive management, to me is kind of hopefully helping us mend that past.
Within the St. Vrain Forest Health Partnership, there was a project that involved 43 private properties and a small community in the foothills outside Boulder called Jamestown. The community had mixed ideas about how to protect themselves and their properties from a disastrous wildfire.
I had a lot of folks that said, you're never going to get my neighbor to be on board. They will never, ever cut their tree.
So Chiara went and sat at people's kitchen tables and talked through options. She shared how she could help get the funding to do the work, which can be costly. To have professionals come and remove the fuel, the cost is about $6,000 an acre.
When that problem is really big and you don't have the resources to be able to really do anything about it, of course you're going to, start to feel hopeless about it and say, I'm just not going to cut my trees. It's not going to do anything. This isn't going to help anyone.
Through this process, she witnessed a whole new kind of conversation.
I just saw this shift where people were like, oh, I just have to tell you what I want to see and let you on my property and, talk through this, and then it'll happen. And I think that really helped folks feel like they could do something, which made it more of a reality, which made people really dig into that discomfort of change more, because change is really uncomfortable. And so if you don't know that it's going to be beneficial, why dig into that discomfort?
Chiara's approach takes time, but she's dedicated because she's witnessed results.
And through that trust building, through really long conversations, through talking over and over again, I think we ended up getting everyone except one landowner on board. I've seen people's willingness to compromise, to move beyond what they, originally felt was a healthy forest, in quotes, and move toward an understanding that a super dense forest isn't necessarily always the healthiest version of that forest. And that varies by elevation, but really people's willingness to say, I want to be a great steward of this land. I'm going to get the information that I need to be a great steward is kind of what I would love to see. Because I think once we all realize that fire's not the enemy, I think we'll be more able to coexist with it in a way that's beneficial for everybody.
Her work is about building respect, trust, and ultimately resilience, not just in forests, but in people.
Really, it's about being a person. So just saying, I hear you. This is really hard. I'm sorry that you've been put in this situation where you're on this land and, we've suppressed wildfires for 150 plus years. And so now you have to make the hard decisions. That's a really hard thing to deal with. Those trees are your home. You love those trees. Those are the trees that your kids play in. You watch the birds in that tree outside your window every day. But we're here to support you in making the best decision for the ecology and for yourself.
I'm walking down a private road in Allens Park, Colorado, with Kiara and a crew from the Watershed Center.
The sign says Chipmunk Crossing, 1 p.m. to 4 p.m. The signs here are incredible. It also has on the other side, it says this tree is stationary.
The property is 40 acres, with almost a dozen cabins spread among pine trees and scraggly alpine tundra. It's chilly out.
Hummingbird.
We are a stone's throw from the southeast corner of Rocky Mountain National Park and the East Troublesome Fire burn scar. Kiara is out marking trees for fire mitigation.
And so the blue paint is on trees that are marked for removal. There's a couple different ways you can mark a property. One is to mark trees you're going to keep. One is to mark trees you're going to cut. A lot of folks would make an assumption that we would come in and do a clear cut because a lot of people have the kind of preconception for justified reasons that in order to reduce fire risk, we can't really have trees on the property, period. But a lot of these trees are really resilient to wildfire, right?
She points to a tree with beautiful orange and brown bark.
If we look at this big old ponderosa here, it's limbed itself up, so it drops its own lower branches, and that's a fire adaptation to keep fire from getting from the ground into the canopy of the tree, because ponderosa bark is super thick. It's resistant to fire, so you'll see a lot of fire scars. We're walking past a lot of them right now.
In order to protect these old ponderosas, Kiara and the landowner decided to make some strategic cuts to some of the lodgepole pines. Lodgepole pines are only adapted to high severity, low frequency fire. And due to fire suppression, they've grown in dense around the ponderosa, which is now creating a fire risk.
We're really restoring the ability of this area to receive wildland fire without excessive rates of tree mortality. From where we're standing, we can only see 3 marked trees for removal. So this work doesn't always mean blasting open an area. It can also mean being really nuanced with the approach. I'm gonna grab some paint.
I leave Kiara to her marking and walk over to talk to the property owner, John Zumwinkle. He's walking down the road and pointing out some additional work to one of the crew.
The one that's lean, it needs to be cut before it comes down.
This saw's coming on.
Expecting a timber!
Yeah.
John's family has owned this property since the 1920s. And for the past 15 years, he's been taking steps to protect it from fire.
So this is a great place to grow up. And my purpose now is to provide another set of generations of kids the same opportunity. So that's what we're doing. We're trying to, preserve this and resurrect it, providing kids an opportunity. Playing with frogs, climbing on rocks, building teepees, playing in the stream.
Walking the property, looking at old log cabins, is like stepping back in time. John points down the road.
There's a building that they built that was a tool shed, an ice house, and a wood shed. And in the middle one, they put sawdust insulation, and they would take ice, and they would take ice from the river and cut it up, and they'd put it in there and keep it as long as they could and use it in their trickle-down refrigerators for taking care of food.
He sees himself as a steward of this land and the memories and the stories that go with it.
I'm an only child of a family that allowed me to grow up in the summers in the mountains in Colorado, and I finished my work in corporate America with the dream of coming back here and preserving this family legacy. So it's my intention to do that for as long as I'm able.
John and I walk over to his cabin. It's dark wood and stands mostly apart from the forest around it. We sit in some lawn chairs.
Talk to me about how you view both yourself, this property, and as part of this broader ecosystem and community.
Well, I think that we need to be responsible for each other. And that's kind of one of my fundamental values and principles. We're all in this together, whether we like it or not. And the planet's transforming, and we need to do the science and based on facts and figure out the best way to do it.
He was an early adopter of the Watershed Center's project. He sees their approach as a necessity if he wants to keep spending time up here, even though it might feel counter to his worldview at times, or at odds with the mix of opinions in the community.
I'm an environmentalist, and I understand tree huggers. And one of the problems we've had up here is that what we need to do is we need to cut down a lot of trees. And that's antithetical to, the lungs of the earth. So it's really hard to come to terms with that. This is going to be a very dramatic change. By starting and being a larger landowner and jumping into the fray and, being an example, I'm hoping that I can set an example, walking the talk, right? That's like kind of the basic MO of getting along with everybody is, do what you say you're going to do, have integrity, and care about other people. And people can sense that.
John's leading by example, not just for his community, but the next generation.
I've had a wonderful life, and I want my grandchildren to have the same opportunities, and your children to have the same opportunities. We need to adapt.
Adapting is often easier said than done. Even John acknowledges that. He's created about 30 feet of defensible space around his home. But I notice one little grove of trees right next to his front door. When I ask him about them, I see emotion flicker across his face.
Well, these 3 trees here, I've been looking at since I was 14, sitting on that deck. And I'm kind of fond of them. And they have a lot of character, and they have a lot of animals in them. And, there's a whole ecosystem of hummingbirds and chickadees and, squirrels and things like that, interact with me as I'm, here. And I think it's probably not in my best interest that those trees remain. And that's taken me about 3 years to get used to. So, yeah, I don't know.
As our climate shifts and wildfires grow more intense, we're being forced to reimagine our relationship with the forests around us. It's a delicate balance, protecting what we love while accepting that change is inevitable.
There's an awful lot of beauty here, and it sure makes a lot of sense to me to protect it.
From prescribed burns to tree thinning, we have tools to help shape our landscape's future. But using them requires people coming together, tough conversations, and sometimes difficult compromises. Because if we're not careful, we might lose sight of the forest because of the trees. This is United by Fire. Up next, we explore the policy and funding levers that can better prepare us for a future with wildfire.
This is a massive problem, and it's not something that you can put a Band-Aid on. We need a holistic, comprehensive policy framework for the entire wildfire problem.
Laws of Notion is a production of the Institute for Science and Policy at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science. To learn more, visit lawsofnotion.org. I'm your host, Kristan Uhlenbrock. This episode was produced by me, Carson Frame, and Trisha Waddell, with support from Nicole Delaney and fact-checking by Kate Long. Sound design by Seth Samuel. Original music by Ryan Flores, and additional tracks by Epidemic Sounds. For a full list of credits, check out the show notes. If you enjoyed listening, please rate and review this podcast, and consider supporting the Institute. Learn more about us at institute.dmns.org. See you next week.